Interested in creating VR apps for the Oculus Go? Then this episode is for you, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo Lewin, an Immersive Technologies evangelist, creator, producer, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest today is Tom Szirtes, the founder and CEO of Mbryonic, an agency involved in the design, development, and distribution of immersive experiences. Today, Tom will share with us some tips and tricks on how to design, develop, and distribute VR apps on the Oculus Go platform. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I found out about you by downloading an app. It's on the Oculus Go. It's a training app. Was it Discover It?
Deliver It, actually.
Oh, Deliver It. That's right. It's about logistics. And I was really impressed because how you guys push the limit of the Oculus Go, and I'm very interested in enterprise and training for VR beyond gaming. A little bit we'll talk about that app and your process, but really mainly, how should people go about developing apps for the Go? But before we do that, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Okay, yeah, so I've been in development for a long time, and I started programming when I was 10 years old, back in the 80s. I'm showing my age now. Yeah, so computers have always been around me, and after I left university, I started a career making video games for Sega. And I've worked at various video games companies over the years. As a developer, I left there, went a bit into mobile, and then around 5 years ago, decided to set up on my own. When I started, I wasn't 100% sure exactly what I was going to do. I just wanted to do cool stuff, and the idea was to take all the experience and creativity you get in games, because I don't have much chance to play games these days, but I still love them. And for me, the high point of design and technology all coming together, I want to take some of that and then apply that to industries outside of games. And as it happened, around that time was when the first Oculus prototypes came around, the DK1, DK2, and I've had an opportunity to have a go on one of those. And it really made me think about, this seemed like, for me personally, a perfect marriage of something I could really get excited about, something new where I could sort of create a company which, we're all on the same level playing field, and help maybe form the future a bit.
So you started creating VR before you started playing with VR, or did you play some VR and then you got interested?
The first time I've had a VR experience was a friend of mine actually was one of the original Kickstarter backers for the DK1, the Oculus Rift, and he got his development kit and he invited me to his house and showed me I can't remember what was the name of that demo. It's a demo when you just walk around the house, very, very simple, I think, Tuscany, that's it, the Tuscany demo on the Oculus. And I put on the headset, and the DK1 was quite a simple device. You looked through it and you could definitely, the screen door effect was very pronounced. You're basically looking at all these pixels in front of you. For me, it was a transformative experience. I got a sort of a shiver down my spine and thought, I've seen the future. And it's been a long time since I felt that and got that excited about technology. And at that point, really, I knew that this is something I wanted to get involved in. And 5 years later, I've managed to carve a career and a small business out of this technology. And yeah, really excited for the future.
It's awesome that you were able to see beyond the current limitations back then of the VR headset, right? And understand that even though you had the screen door effect that was really bad and probably got motion sick, you understood that this is truly the future and where we're going. So that was really, really great. And we need more people like that I still hear people today going yeah, the Oculus Quest is great, but it doesn't do this. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me, right? You've got to understand the future here, what's happening.
Yeah, it reminds me of it's not very political, the Louis C.K. sketch. He was on TV. He was complaining about people on airplanes complaining that the Wi-Fi didn't work well on the airplanes.
Right.
And it's like, have you not experienced a miracle of flight? It's just, we get so used to things so quickly, don't we? But
right.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you put on that headset and you felt you were somewhere else, and that's the magic of VR. It's your brain can tell you I'm in a room, I've got a headset on, but there's part in the back of your brain which is going, oh no, I've moved, I'm not in the real world anymore. And that's really the power of this media.
Yep, definitely. So what's your current favorite experience?
Oh, you got me there. I still, do you know what? There's a couple. They're really old, actually. I mean, I know there's lots of new great games out there, but one of my favorite was one of the very first things. It was called A Line of Sight by a Polish developer, and it's very simple. You sat in a chair, and as you looked around, things changed behind you, and you'd look back, and then like the wall would get closer. Grass would start growing, and you looked around, and suddenly you found yourself on top of a building, and then you fell off a chair, and it was a kind of 3-5 minute experience. Still to this day, I think it's one of the best experiences. I also love sort of any experience that really uses the touch controllers. For me, being able to reach out, grab, and manipulate objects is still so much fun in VR, and that's not something that can really be reproduced. Often when I'm showing people VR, I've shown them the original touch demos with a little robot in the van. I think that's a great experience. But I've played sort of games like sort of Lone Echo, and there's other games which are obviously bursting full of sort of innovation, and really they're getting much more polished these days, which is really nice to see.
Right, it really is. Yeah, I just picked up a couple, including Transference. I don't know if you played that, but that is a very creepy horror kind of game, and it's amazing what they've done with that. It really, if you like horror, definitely recommend that one. So, well, very cool. Well, let's jump into Oculus Go development, and maybe we can start by talking about what are some of the key differences when a developer is considering if they should be developing for the Go or the Rift or the Vive, and now, of course, the Oculus Quest, which we'll touch upon a little bit later on. But what are some of those key differences when deciding which one to go for?
Well, to decide which one to go for is really about who are your audience. Now, we do a lot of work. We're not so much developing for the app stores, though the deliver it was for the app stores, but often we're delivering for clients, these big companies and organizations. What we really have to think about is what is the most convenient format to get this VR experience across, and given our ambitions, what can we do on different platforms? So there's essentially 2 or 3 fundamental differences between the Go and the Rift. I would say the first one is performance. So the Oculus Go has probably a fraction of the performance of an Oculus Rift, and that's just in terms of sort of graphical throughput and the amount of complexity of the graphics you can do. So you're literally probably talking about, maybe a tenth of what you can do on a Rift in terms of like graphical complexity. That said, you can still do a lot of really cool stuff on the Go. You just have to work within its limitations. The second key difference between the Go and the Rift is that the Go only has 3 degrees of freedom. It's not 6 off. That impacts how you design experiences, I believe, because, there's some experiences where you want the users to be able to maybe look around an object or walk around a bit. And obviously the Go, there's got no positional tracking. So it only knows the rotation, the orientation of your head. If you push your head forward or backwards or step sideways, the VR experience is not going to follow you. So you have to design for that. And the third one is around input devices. So with the Oculus Rift, pretty much every Rift now comes with the touch controllers. And then again, they're 6 degrees of freedom controllers. You can reach out and grab stuff and manipulate, while the Oculus Go controller, again, is freed off. So essentially, it works more like a kind of pointer. If you put your hand forward or backwards, it doesn't know that your controller is always stuck in the same place, but what you can do is kind of tilt your hand up and down or left and right to point objects. So that has a kind of quite fundamental impact on the way that you design your app.
So as a developer or designer, is there a way to create an app, let's say, that supports the full 6-DoF experience, but then can also be brought into the Go and a 3-DoF experience? Or do you have to mainly develop for the Go and or the Rift separately?
Well, actually, with the Deliberate project, we built it for the Rift and the Go. So actually, that's a good example of, yes, you can design for both, but you just have to adapt it. So for instance, in the experience, we have, for instance, there's a couple of quite sort of simple interactions where you get to sort of pull levers or turn keys and things like that. Now, in the Rift version, if you want to pull a lever, you move your hand out, you put your hand over the lever, you press the trigger button, you pull it back. We had to adapt that for the Go. So in the Go version, you would have a laser pointer. It comes out of your controller. You would point at the lever, and then we would use a kind of a rotational, like rotate up or a rotate down to move a lever. Now, from a developer point of view, we knew when we were building the Rift version that we were going to build the Go version. So So we always had that in the back of the mind when we designed it. And you can share quite a lot of the code between the two. It's just that, like 90% of the code base for the two versions we made is the same. But yeah, it's just those little interactions you have to tweak. And there's a whole bunch of other kind of TRC stuff when you get into sort of submitting to the store, but you have to bear in mind for the Go.
So do you have, from a developer's perspective, when you're creating the code base, let's say the C#, right? Or C++, depending on which one you chose, do you have like a code that's used across all sorts of devices? And then you have like external files that take into account the different devices, so that way you can have different developers working on each of them? Or how does that work?
Well, what we've done, and because we've been doing this for a number of years, and we've probably delivered, I don't know, maybe 30 different applications in that time. So what we do is we have our own internal kind of set of functions that we use across projects, because that obviously saves time, and we try to make those work across different devices. So the first one we were originally trying to bridge between was over the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, and then before the Oculus Go, we were doing a lot of sort of Samsung Gear development. So again, we've created sort of components, because we use Unity, so we're developing in C#, and we've created components that deal with quite a lot of that. So essentially, we have more or less sometimes the same code base, and the software detects which system it's running on, and then it will adapt, appropriately depend on the particulars. Now, Unity actually does quite a lot of that for you anyway. And it's interesting, as when we started off developing on VR, we had to do a lot of that code ourselves, because Oculus had completely their own libraries. HTC, the Vive had the Steam libraries. And, Unity at that point didn't have a way of like a cross-platform handling for that. So we had to build that ourselves anyway in the early days. Now, of course, Unity do more and more of that for you in the box. So you don't have to do that. But there's always functions and ways of functionality that you want, that it just saves a lot of time if it works on the Rift and works on the Vive and works on the Go. So we just kind of maintain, in each project, we update our internal libraries to do these kind of common functions that we know we're going to use again and again in different applications.
Obviously, there's no grab function right on the Go, like you can grab on a Oculus Rift or a HTC Vive. So you mentioned you use sort of the pointer, but how do you kind of make it so it's grabbable?
Well, we remapped. So, the Touch has two buttons. It has a trigger button on the index finger, and it also has the grab button, which is kind of wrapped around it, typically around your third finger. Now, as you say, the Oculus Go just has a trigger button. So what we found actually is that a lot of first-time users don't actually know where the grab button is a lot of time. I don't think the grab button on the Oculus Rift or even the HTC Vive is actually that intuitive for new users on VR. So a lot of them, it's really hard. You basically say, use the trigger button, because that's the easiest one for them to find. So in that particular case, we mapped the grab functionality to the trigger button anyway. Our interactions were quite simple. We didn't have to have multimodal interactions like press this button to shoot and this button to grab. And so we had just one object, a contextual object, so a lever or keys or a menu system, and one button, which is the trigger button. And with that trigger button, you might just press it once, or you might keep it held, squeeze it, in which case that was for us a grab. And that's typically what you have to do for devices like the Go, where you have a limited number of buttons on it.
So are there frameworks or apps that developers can use to quickly start developing? Let's say they don't want to do Unity, or they don't know Unity. Is Unity the only way to go for creating native apps on the Go? Or are there other apps that people can use to quickly prototype and create apps that are native, not like web VR driven?
Yeah, I believe so. Obviously, there are apps out there that do certain specific tasks. Like, for instance, even things like Tilt Brush. If you wanted to build environments, you could build environments in Tilt Brush or Google Blocks. And, you can even do like simple animations in them. So you could use that to prototype, for instance, an environment. Once you start adding in more behaviors, like more complex interactions, again, I think there are some applications out there. I know that there's one which is I can't remember the name of it, but you kind of get to puppeteer. You can kind of put characters in and you can kind of animate them by puppeteering them with your hands. And you can kind of record scripts and camera movements. So if you wanted to tell a story, for instance, you could use that and not have to know any programming. For us, yeah, I mean, we use Unity. I mean, Unity it's a pretty easy application to pick up and get very basic stuff working. And you don't necessarily have to know that much programming to actually get to use that, because there's quite a lot of sort of visual plugins that let you kind of do essentially visual programming, which is kind of easier than typing scripts. So from our perspective, because we have a background in software development and programming, we like to write scripts because that's what we spent years doing. So we're quite comfortable with that. And ultimately, if you want to really get something that I think you could say, if you want to create something that you wanted to launch on the application store for Oculus Go, I think it would be very hard for you to avoid learning a bit of scripting and getting a bit in depth with a program like Unity. And from what I believe, Unity or Unreal, I know Unreal is really good as well. There's plenty of functionality in there to be able to create experiences. And you can get, specifically with VR as well, there's some good, on the asset stores, there's some good libraries of common VR stuff like picking up objects and grabbing objects and opening doors and levers and UI. So there's some developers who produce ready to go sort of plugins for Unity that you can put together quite quickly.
Well, let's talk a little bit about frameworks, right? Because one of the things that helped web development and websites expand was the fact that we went from having to write everything from scratch constantly to really robust frameworks that allow you to bootstrap and get started, right? Without having to write the basics. Do you feel that we're there yet with VR, or do we have a long way to go?
I don't think we're there yet, but there are a number of frameworks you can use to kind of bootstrap yourself in VR. For instance, on the Unity Asset Store, there's a popular one called VR Toolkit, which provides a number of standard functions that you might want in VR, like picking up objects, grabbing them, throwing them, pulling levers, interacting with menus and UI. Now, we don't know at this stage that those kind of toolkits are going to become the standard, because we haven't really decided where the metaverse or the VR, if that's going to be how it is, or the VR apps of the future are going to be native, or we're going to have some open standard like we do for web. I suspect that given enough time, we will probably come back to an open standard. I have my reservations about web VR, so I kind of hope whatever we do is not the web in VR, but it could be. So I think we're probably a few years off that. And the moment is you still have to make a choice about how you want to get to deliver to people. And for now, that's a native experience, and you're going to build that in Unity or Unreal. Maybe a third-party company will come along and create something specially for VR. I mean, there's things like Sensei, which they're creating their own VR worlds. Yeah, I believe somewhere off before we get to standards.
And between Unreal and Unity, does it really matter for the Go?
For the Go, I don't believe it matters. I mean, essentially what the Go is an Android device. When you're developing for Go, it's very similar to developing, say, for the Samsung Gear or an Android app. And I think Unreal and Unity do that well. I don't have a huge amount of experience with Unreal. I've only played with it a little bit. So I can recommend Unity. I mean, Unity certainly has the biggest development community. And the benefits of Unity are that if you get stuck or need some plugin or need some help doing something, there's a huge amount of resources out there to do that for you.
So from a scripting perspective, if you go with Unity, you're obviously doing C#. If you go with Unreal, you're doing C++. Any other scripting languages that a developer needs to know when developing directly for the Go? Do they need to understand the actual Go SDK as well?
Not really, no. I mean, there's a few functions that you want from the Oculus SDK. They don't have a specific Go SDK. It's just kind of their Unity integration. There's some additional libraries to access some more low-level or Go-specific functions. But 90% of it will just all be in native Unity. And that's C#, yeah.
I see. And how do you use Unity to prototype and then publish your app for testing? Or how do you go about creating, let's say, a prototype without investing so much time and effort into the actual application, but you still want to experience it in the Oculus Go? How do you go about doing that?
Because we have a Rift, we tend to prototype on the Rift. And when you're talking about a prototype, really what you're talking about is some kind of minimum viable product, or, and it's not even MVP. It's a slice of the application functionality that you feel you need to test, or you need to be able to create in order to communicate what you want to create in the future, or to understand what you create. So the key with prototyping is to understand really what is the value value of a prototype. So quite often with prototypes, you're not going to be focusing on having lots of very sophisticated graphics, because that might not be the core of what you need to show in your app. It might be more sort of just pure interaction. So what's common in game design or game development, similar for this, is a thing called grey boxing, where you build out environments. Not, say you're building a castle and you want to walk around it. You don't go to the detail of building every brick into all the walls. What you do is you kind of block out the space, you move around it, pick up objects, and work out whether your base assumptions about that experience are correct before going on and building lots of other detail. Now, on certain projects, it might be that actually what you need to prototype is the graphics. So what we might well do, and what we actually did with this when we first started working on this project, because the first one we did on the Go, was to really try and understand what is the performance of the Go. So when we design our graphics, how many polygons have we got to work with? What kind of shaders do we work with? So we kind of built our own little internal test suite where we just kind of threw objects onto the screen and we could tweak with the settings. So one interesting thing at the beginning of when we started work on the Go, if you use the default settings on the Go in Unity, you actually get quite a pixelated display, because there's a function when you render for these devices, there's basically a kind of scaling that happens before it scales the resolution of the screen before it goes onto the headset. So first things we noticed is that, hey, everything in this test it looks much more pixely and jaggedy than other stuff that we know we can do on the Go. So that was a good thing that we could pick up early on in development and then kind of work around. In the end, the fix is really simple. It's just like one line of code where you adjust the scale, the display resolution scaling. But again, you want to understand what is the impact on performance, because one of the key things with working in VR is that you need to keep your frame rate very high. On the Rift, they recommend it's 90 frames a second, and on the Go, 60 frames per second.
Well, now they're allowing you to push it to 72, right?
That's correct, yeah. And, you might want to, it really depends on your application. So, like, if I was making like a fast-moving racing game, there would probably be quite some advantages in getting to 72. If I'm doing something where I'm more kind of just looking around and I'm not moving so much, it's not so fast-paced, then you probably want to stay at 60, because you've got a bit more time to render each frame, and that allows you to do a bit more of your graphics.
So from a performance perspective, do you have any tips in, like, for example, reduce the number of draw calls or compress your texture or reduce the, merge the objects? I mean, do you have any kind of tips like that?
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty much the same tips as for doing any kind of mobile development, or if you've done stuff on the sort of mobile VR headset. So it's not so much about your polygon count. I mean, the polygon counts are kind of important, but they can pop out quite a lot of polygon counts. Yeah, so definitely about your draw calls, the number of draw calls that you have. So if you don't know what that means, it's basically draw calls is essentially it's linked to the number of materials. So what we did on Deliver-It is, rather than have different material for each face, we would pack them together into a texture atlas and then share that atlas across lots of different materials. You want to think about what objects can be static versus dynamic if they're moving around. Things like shadowing and lighting are very intensive, so you had to play around with shadowing quite a lot, with the settings there. How far do you need the shadows to be off in the distance? Do they need to be real time? Could you use static lights, bake your lighting? Think about if you're using specific shader effects, which are intensive. Unfortunately, pretty much all post-processing kind of image effects are not going to work very well on Oculus Go. So like in the Rift version, we were using bloom quite a lot. We had to switch that off on the Oculus Go. Things like screen space ambient occlusion, again, wasn't going to work on the Oculus Go. One thing on the Rift, because we did the Rift version, we didn't have any level of detail models, but for the Go, it was quite important for us to have LODs on some of the scenes. Yeah, number of transparencies. I mean, if you Google that, you'll see there's a whole bunch of kind of quite good articles on video tutorials, certainly sort of Unity have made regards standard practice for developing on and optimizing on mobile. And pretty much the same applies to VR.
And what kind of tools do you use for testing the performance itself, like your frame rates?
Yeah, there's a tool on the Oculus Go, which is very useful. Basically, it gives you a frame rate counter in the game, and also it will tell you sort of basic functions like, sort of draw calls, etc. And that works directly on the device. So basically, when you put it on the headset, you can see a live update of the frame rate. You can also profile remotely from Unity. You can see Unity profiling tools are getting a lot better, and you can see how your time's being used up. One important thing is, if you're going to submit for the App Store, you have to basically keep above 60 frames a second. If you dip below 60 for an extended period of time, say more than like a second or two, that they might reject your app from the App Store. So quite a lot of what we did at the end was really just trying to make sure that this frame rate didn't dip down too much. And to be fair, we're an agency, we've got to build stuff within quite tight timelines and budgets. So we could definitely have done more, and we're going to update the app actually in the future. So my plan is to we've got various ideas about how we're going to make the app increase the graphics, make the graphics nicer, and also keep the frame rate down. So there's further optimizations that we can do.
Do you feel like people, because you have the power of the GPU on the Rift, that sometimes developers tend to get a little bit lazy, and then when you're developing for the Go and even the Oculus Quest coming out, you're going to have to not be so lazy? And I don't know if lazy is the right word, but...
Yeah, there's definitely a big difference in performance between those two systems. So you have to do everything you can to squeeze out that performance. And also think about the art style of the game. Don't fight the limitations. Try to work with them. So for us in Deliberate, we picked a deliberately kind of low polygon art style because that works on the go. It looks attractive. If we'd taken another approach and tried to do like really realistic models but then had low quality textures and bad lighting, it would have looked worse than if we tried to do something simpler and make that look nice.
Yeah, no, and I think actually that's one of the things that I enjoyed about the Deliberate was the graphic style. I think it actually fits for that, and it kind of makes sense. If you look at, for example, Superhot VR, the graphics aren't that extensive there, right? They're pretty simple graphics, but it fits the experience really well.
That's key with any project you're working on, is really to define that visual style and make sure it works with the app. There's some things you can do there's tricks to make things look nicer. For instance, you can sort of pre-render bits of environments and kind of paste them as billboards. And, there's lots of creative things you can do that to kind of cheat the system a bit. But each time you do that, you're placing a kind of limitation on the user experience and what the user can do within that environment. So you have to think about what is the experience that you're trying to create and what is the best art style in order to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you mentioned you develop on the Rift. How do you test on the Go? Because even though you're developing on the Rift, you still want to do testing on the Go to make sure that, like, for example, you mentioned the bloom effect, right? That's not going to work on the Go. So do you publish every single time? How do you connect the app to the Go and then do constant testing? And what's your QA process like?
Yeah, the reason we use a Rift is it's really the speed that you can turn stuff around in. So in the Rift, when you press play in the editor, you can just put on your Oculus Rift and you're immediately testing. You don't have to build the app, but when you're working with any mobile device like the Oculus Go or even iPhone or Android, there's a build process before you can actually get it to run on the device. And that build process can be quite slow. It can take at best, it can be like a minute. It can be like 8 minutes, and for big projects, or 10 minutes even. So you don't want to be like making lots of small tweaks and then pressing a button and then getting a cup of tea for 10 minutes. It really just kills your productivity. So that's why we build as much of the experience we can on the Rift. And we have the luxury because we're professional developers and we have that equipment lying around. So we build it and test it in the Rift. And then when we want to test for performance or interaction, then we will build it on the Go. And that's as simple as, Unity make that very simple. You have to actually tell it to switch platform. You press build. And if you've got your SDK set up and you've got a USB cable between your PC and your device, then it will just push it on there and run it on the device, and then you can test it. But yeah, as I say, it's a bit of a long-winded process. So we try to do that as little as possible just for our productivity.
Yeah, it makes sense because the main functionality you can test on the Rift quickly, like you said, by pressing play, but then you schedule probably some builds, right? Maybe 2 or 3 times a day, and then do testing during that time.
Yeah, and we don't use it much ourselves, but Oculus have Oculus Build as well, which for mobile development that can push remotely, I believe. I've not used it for Go, so I'm not sure quite how that works on the Go, but on iOS and Android, I believe you can sort of get these links that you can download and install on.
Well, let's talk about the submission process. So you're done with the app, everything looks good, testing, we're done, and we're ready to submit it. What's that submission process like on the Oculus Store itself?
It's reasonably straightforward. The main one is to go through their TRCs, which is their technical requirements checklist. And there will be a bunch of stuff in there that you'll have to make sure your application covers. The frame rate is just one of them, but there's other things about what behavior happens when people press special buttons on the controller. And one thing we didn't really think about is there's a setting on the Oculus Go which allows you to go from right-handed to left-handed mode, and you have to support that, which to customize, we just didn't think about it because stores until we went through that list. So it's a good idea to go through that list quite early in your development cycle so you don't have to deal with all that stuff right at the end. And then it's really a question of you build your app, you upload it. They've got a web portal, you upload it to there, and then you have to fill out a bunch of descriptions, questions about who are the audience, are there any age ratings. There are quite a lot of different screenshots and marketing images you have to provide them in various different formats, which can be a bit of a pain. And then you submit it for approval. Yeah, I think they were pretty quick. I think we got kind of turned around in a few days from the Oculus Store, maybe 5 days it was.
Did you get approved right away, or did they come back and go, okay, we're almost there, but you got to do this, this, and this?
No, we're lucky we got past first time.
So the key is to hit those technical requirements that they list, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Anything you've learned from that process that you can share with first-time publishers?
I think the process is pretty straightforward. If you've developed for other app stores, then I think you'll find this one is not that different from other app stores. If you're working to deadlines, just build in plenty of time to get into that process, get reviewed. You might have to make changes. So I think if you're working for a specific launch schedule or client has deadlines, just make sure you've planned that time in well in ahead, because that can take you by surprise and leave you in trouble.
How much time do you feel that you need to put aside just for the whole publishing process, like a couple of weeks or?
Yeah, I think a couple of weeks would be minimum, is probably.
Cool. And then what about submitting updates? Do you have to go through another process for that to submit, let's say, a new version to the app or bug updates?
Well, they've got these things called release channels, and the release channels you can kind of push to beta testers, for instance, before you push to the main update. So yeah, essentially you upload a new version and then that will get pushed as an update once it's, again, gone through the process and been approved. So it's pretty straightforward.
I see. And your app, I know, is free. The delivered app is free, right, that you can download. But what's the business model from their perspective? Is it like a 70-30 split? Do you know what the split is?
Yeah, it's a 30% split, I believe.
So they take 30 and you keep 70?
Yes.
Is there a sign-up fee?
I don't believe there was. I can't remember.
Okay. All right. We won't hold you to it.
Yeah, you certainly have to register as a developer. And I think there's a few things you have to do, but it's not like Steam where you have to pay an upfront fee.
And is there the ability to add like in-app purchases like you do on a mobile device? Let's say if you want to give the experience for free, and I haven't run into any experiences that have that right now, but I'm wondering if you heard anything where they're going to allow that kind of in-app experiences where you can get XP points or whatever for a certain amount of money.
I've not looked into that ourselves because it wasn't relevant for this project. I believe they've got a process in there for doing in-app purchases. It's part in the development center. So I believe you can do it, but we don't have experience with that ourselves.
So with all this development you've done on the go, what's one thing, like a tip you can give developers? Hey, make sure you do this when you're thinking about developing for the go, whatever this is.
I would say, just to summarize, there's a couple of different things. Read the TRCs early so you know what you're developing for. Make sure that you really understand the performance of the device and limitations, and the performance in terms of polygon count and the shaders and graphics. And obviously, know your audience as well. It's a good idea to know who your audience are. I think the audience for Go is quite different from the Oculus Rift. So, for instance, if you're probably making a sort of hardcore role-playing game, that might be the Oculus Rift is more your audience, and Oculus Go more likely to be quite more casual users. Be interested to see with the Quest what audience that attracts.
Yeah, definitely. Well, now that you mentioned the Quest, what's your take on that? I don't know if you got a chance to, I don't know if you went to Oculus Quest or Oculus Connect or not, but if you had a chance to check it out, and also, are you going to be developing for the Go, or you think you'll be switching your focus to the Quest?
I've had the opportunity to have a go on the Quest, actually. Yeah, I think it's a really nice, interesting device. I'm very, quite excited about that. The key thing for me that the Quest does over the Go is it's 6 degrees of freedom. And, for me, that makes VR experiences special. Even the simple thing, just being able to move your head, tilt your head a bit, just to look around objects, I think that's so important for immersion and, being able to reach out and grab stuff. So, yeah, I'd love to do some more Quest development. I don't think it means that the Oculus Go, I think, the Oculus Go is obviously a stepping stone, and so is the Santa Cruz. All these devices are stepping stones towards towards something that's going to be further down the line. It's going to be a price thing, so the Oculus Go is $200 and the Quest is $400. So again, when we talk to clients, they're thinking of buying units or giving them to their employees or putting them into schools or marketing events, wherever they want to use them. That cost issue is going to come up. I would certainly will try and push them towards the Quest, I think, just because we think we can create a better experience. So, we're looking always to try and do better and push the boundaries of VR. So we're going to want to work on the best equipment, but obviously some of our clients have a budgetary constriction. So I'm sure we'll be doing a lot more for Go. But yeah, the Quest is really interesting. Looking forward to getting started on that.
And who knows, maybe they'll bring a lower quality 6DoF experience to the Go. I mean, that's my take on it, I think, in the future, because 3DoF, it's got to be, like you said, a stepping stone right now. And I'm sure they'll be able to figure out in the next couple of years to be able to keep down the cost of the Go, but still offer a 6DoF experience on it.
Yeah, well, I suspect the Quest will become the low-end device and drop the price of that. And then
sort of the entry level.
And there'll be a new device above that, yeah.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, Tom, we're out of time. I really appreciate all the information you shared. It's been great. I do ask every guest one last question, which is, what would you like VR to be like 5 years from now?
I would like VR to be a place where we can all come together and feel like we can really express our creativity. For me, VR is an empowering medium. VR becomes magical when we can do things that we can't do in real life. So I'd like to see lots of people in VR creating amazing things, sharing them and sharing ideas and becoming closer through this technology.
That's a great future. I'm looking forward to that future, actually. So, all right, Tom. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If people want to get a hold of you, do you want to give an email or a Twitter or a website, whatever you like?
So I've got a Twitter account, which is at Tom Mbryonic, which is TOMBRYONIC, or you can come to a website, www.embryonic, so MBRYONIC.com.
And we'll put all that on the show notes.
Great, thanks.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Tom. And to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with me. If you enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and like us on iTunes or SoundCloud. For more episodes, check out howtocreatevr.com/iTunes or howtocreatevr.com/SoundCloud. If you like to watch video interviews and how-to tutorials all about immersive technologies, please subscribe to my YouTube channel at howtocreatevr.com/YouTube. If you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great VR and AR presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about how to create VR, AR, or MR experiences, please visit howtocreatevr.com. So until the next episode, I'm your host, Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.